If you've not been with us for the past few weeks, we are in the middle of a series called Trust the Story. This series is a walk through the book of Ruth. And we're good. Okay. And we started this series, okay, if you were here, you'll know this. If you weren't, we started this series a few weeks ago with a couple of important terms, definitions, if you will, empire and kingdom. Because what we really want to talk about in this series is we don't just want to talk about the story of Ruth. We want you to know the story of Ruth, but we want you to know why the story of Ruth is important. And part of that is that we ourselves need to evaluate in our own lives, where do we put our trust? Are we trusting in empire or are we trusting in kingdom? And so we gave you these two terms. I'm going to review them really quick here. The first one that we gave you was empire. We talked about this term empire, and basically what we said was, empire is the natural result of humanity when left to our own devices. In other words, if there's nothing from God telling us how to do this, the best we can come up with is what we have in empire. And you have seen empires all over the world. I just read an article this morning about, all the stuff happening in Russia and Europe and all this stuff. And we see what happens in empire, right? We see what happens in empire. And one of the things we said was that on our own, this is the best we can do, right? Without God, on our own, this is the best that we can come up with. We also gave you some keywords that you can relate to empire. And those words are wealth, power, security, self-protection, self-preservation, control, wealth. And I want you to pause for just a moment, and I want you to think about this. Be really honest with yourself. How many of these things do you naturally in your humanity tend to put your trust in? I mean, really, this is not a condemning question. It's just a question. Like, how much would we have to strive not to put our trust in these things because they come naturally to us? It's where we put our trust. And it's not that these things in and of themselves are bad, right? It's not that security is a bad thing, that safety. It's not that wealth is bad. These things aren't bad, but when we place our trust in them above God, they become negative to us in bringing about something different. Because I believe that God has a better way for people, right? I believe that God has something different in mind than this idea of empire. And so I would ask you to consider the question, what if God actually has something else in mind for his creation? What if God has a better way? Now, some of you are like, duh, right? You're thinking that's a stupid question. Of course he does. But I want you to really think about, how much do you actually believe that? Do you believe it enough to put your trust in it? Or is it just something cool to talk about and think about? Because I believe that God truly does, that he truly does have a better way, and that he points us toward something different, and that something different is what we're calling kingdom. And kingdom we described this way: the result of trusting God and the story that he is telling. That if we are really willing to trust God instead of those things that are rooted in empire, kingdom can be the result. The key words that we gave you for kingdom were these: peace, sacrifice, service, hospitality, partnership, trust. And I want to ask you again, and I know it seems like such an easy question, but it's really not. What if God actually expects us to trust him? And some of you are like, yeah, okay, I feel like, yeah, that's a pretty easy question. But what if he actually expects us to trust him? What if kingdom is not some otherworldly existence in some other dimension or place? What if it's not just a spiritual thing that exists in the lives of people who accept Jesus as their Lord and Savior? Because that's what I grew up hearing and being taught was, well, kingdom is just all the people who follow Jesus. And I don't think that that's not true. But what is the byproduct of that? Should it be empire or should it be kingdom? That question is a little bit harder, I know. But what if God is thinking, hey, if these people actually do what I'm asking them to do, It would bring kingdom to this place instead of empire. What if God is calling us as his people to be people of kingdom, not just people who exist in a kingdom, but people who bring kingdom to the world in which we live? I know, you're like, wow, that's hard, that's deep. Now, we're going to talk a whole lot more about that in our next series, so I'm going to stop. Okay? But I want to make sure that you're thinking about that as we continue walking through the story of Ruth. So for now, what I want you to do is make a mental note. Kingdom and empire. What are the differences between them, and what is God asking us to do? So while you think a little bit about that, I want to review the story of Ruth. Where have we been so far? In the beginning of our story, a man named Elimelech and his wife Naomi took their 2 sons. They left Judah because there was a famine in the land, and they went to Moab. They were not really supposed to go to Moab. This wasn't a great decision, but they did it. And just a clarifying point, I had somebody question me about whether or not I was blaming Naomi for all that happened. And please be clear, in no way, shape, or form do I think that Naomi is responsible for the decision to go to Judah. I believe that Naomi and Elimelech probably made that decision together, but Elimelech was the guy ultimately who's responsible, because in Bible times, women had no control, right? We all know that? Okay, so let's move on from there. They moved to Moab. While they're there, Elimelech dies. So the 2 sons, Mahlon and Chilion, each take Moabite wives while they're there. Mahlon takes a wife named Ruth, and Chilion takes a wife named Orpah. Now, it's not long after that the 2 sons also die. So now you have Ruth, Orpah, and Naomi all living in Moab together without any male representation. Neither of the daughters have had any children. There's no one to leave anything to, and so they essentially have nothing left. Word gets back to Naomi at some point that there's food available in Judah, so she decides to return to Judah. So she tells her daughters-in-law, hey, you go back to your mothers in Moab. You'll find husbands. Life will be good for you. I'm too old for that. I'm going back to my homeland. They both argue with her. She says, no, you must go back. Orpah gives in, but Ruth doesn't. Ruth says, no, I'm going with you. So Naomi relents, and Ruth goes back to Judah with Naomi. While she's there, last week, Tracy opened up to you Ruth chapter 2, and we talked about Ruth meeting Boaz, that Ruth asks to go work in a field and collect grain left behind by the harvesters. She ends up in a field by this wealthy, influential man named Boaz, okay? And so she meets him, and he's kind to her. He allows her to collect the grain that is left behind by the harvesters. In fact, he goes above and beyond really what is expected of him and shows extraordinary kindness to her. Now, I want you to understand something. If you were here last week, then you already heard this. But if not, I want to remind you, this is a key element when we talk about kingdom. One of the things about kingdom is this. God has a plan for it that he outlines in his word. Okay, are you all with me? But there's a reality that we all have to live in. That God expects us to live it out. You see, I think sometimes we get all hung up on this idea that, well, yes, God will provide for the poor and the widowed and the orphan and the foreigner. Well, how does God do that? Oh my goodness, where? Through us. Now, I don't know about you, but I don't like hearing that. I mean, I'll just be totally honest with you. That's scary and intimidating, and that says that there's a whole lot packed into that. Would you agree? So God has this idea for kingdom, and I think some of us think, well, we just come to Jesus and then God works all that stuff out. How many of you have ever been in a place where you were like, I didn't have money and somehow I had money? God took care of all my needs. How many of you have been there? How many of those times did God just magically make money appear on your doorstep? Did it come from another person, or did it just come magically from God through God mail? How did it come to you? You see, there's a reality here when we look at the story that Boaz had to actually live out what God was asking him to do. God has a plan for kingdom, but his people have to execute it. Now, some of you are saying, Brian, that is really humanistic. You're saying that God can't work in the absence of humankind. I'm not saying that at all. I'm saying that God expects, this is a hard one. If you're sitting here today and you're thinking, yes, I follow Jesus, I love to sing worship songs and go to church, and I love to do all these things, but you have a responsibility. to execute kingdom. Woo! You see, if Boaz doesn't show kindness to Ruth, what happens? How does the story go? Well, we don't know, do we? What we do know is that Boaz executed kingdom. Boaz proves to be a man of kingdom. And so I just want you all to think about that as we move throughout this story. Part of the reason that Ruth is a story, part of the reason that we read it, and it's part of the reason that Ruth is in the lineage, the genealogy of Jesus, is because Boaz steps up and does what God expects and asks him to do. How many of you are totally comfortable with that? How many of you are sitting here and you're like, dude, I am totally comfortable living in that? Because I'm going to tell you something, church, that's hard for me. Maybe that's not hard for you, and if it's not, great. That's awesome. But that's hard for me. You want to know why that's hard for me? Because I don't always know what it means to bring kingdom. Right? I don't always know when I read a Bible verse and I think, I don't really know that I like that verse. I'm not sure that verse actually means what that means, so I'm just going to not worry in it. I'm just going to ignore it, and I'm going to lean into my empire where I'm comfortable. Because that's the easy thing to do. Now, what we're going to do is we're going to pick up in chapter 3. That's my review. Now we're going to move to chapter 3. Here's what the Bible tells us in Ruth chapter 3. One day, Ruth's mother-in-law Naomi says to her, "My daughter, I must find a home for you where you will be well provided for." Now here's something that Naomi knows. Naomi knows Jewish tradition. Okay? She knows Jewish tradition. And so she's watching all the time. So she recognizes, Ruth, I have a responsibility to you to find someone who will provide for you. Verse 2 says this, "Now Boaz, with whose women you have worked, he is a relative of ours. Tonight he will be winnowing barley on the threshing floor." So Naomi understands that Boaz is a relative, and that because he's a relative, he has a certain degree of responsibility to his family. The biblical term for this we would call a kinsman redeemer. Now, there's a Hebrew word, goel. That word is not actually used until chapter 4. That'll be next week. But I just want to explain to you a little bit about what that is. This goel, this idea of a kinsman redeemer, is a relative, and this relative has responsibilities to his family. Among these responsibilities is buying back an Israelite who might be taken into slavery, ensuring that someone who murdered a family member is rightly brought to justice, buying back family land that has been lost or forfeited, and carrying on the family name by marrying a widow who has no children. This idea of kinsman redeemer is a person who has the resources to do these things, and so therefore they're expected to. This is another aspect of kingdom, that God is saying, I'm putting into place ways that you will take care of people who by no actions of their own have been put through injustice. Something has happened to them, and you need to step in and help take care of them. Are you all following me? Okay, just want to make sure you're all following me. So Naomi knows all of this, and so she kind of points out to Ruth, hey, that guy whose fields you've been working in, he's a relative of ours. And so tonight, she says, he's going to be winnowing barley on the threshing floor. So essentially, what she does next is she instructs Ruth to, let's say, take some initiative, okay? And put it out there to Boaz that she's interested. Let's just say it that way, okay? So if we pick up reading in verse 3, here's what Naomi says to Ruth. Wash, put on perfume, and get dressed in your best clothes. Then go down to the threshing floor, but don't let him know you are there until he has finished eating and drinking. Then she says this, when he lies down, note the place where he is lying. Then go uncover his feet and lie down. He will tell you what to do. Now, scholars disagree as to what Naomi is actually asking Ruth to do here. Some of you are looking at me smiling, smirking a little bit because you're like, what is he getting ready to say? I know, I promise it won't be like last week. I'm sorry, I couldn't pass it up. So, anyway, scholars disagree. Some scholars believe this, that Naomi is actually asking Ruth to prostitute herself to Boaz. Now, some of you are thinking, how in the world does this verse say that? If you go back and look at Hebrew words, the Hebrew word that is used for feet here is often used to refer to sexual organs, okay? The word lie down is often used, the Hebrew word that's used here for lie down, often refers to the act of sexual intercourse. Not always, but often. So there are some scholars who say, hey, Naomi is telling her, look, you go down there and you make it crystal clear what you want to happen here. Now, I, for one, do not feel like that is what Naomi is asking her to do. Other scholars feel like this is a customary thing in Jewish tradition. This is something that was customary, that laying at the feet of a person would be indicating submissiveness and servitude, a desire to serve you. And Ruth would understand her position in relationship to Boaz, as would Naomi. And so it makes total sense to me that this is merely a way for Ruth to let Boaz know that she is, we'll just say, interested, wanting to submit to him and be his wife if he will have her. Ruth says, I will do whatever you say. This is what she says to Naomi. So she went down to the threshing floor and did everything her mother-in-law told her to do. When Boaz had finished eating and drinking and was in good spirits, he went over to lie down at the far end of the grain pile. Ruth approached quietly, uncovered his feet, and lay down. In the middle of the night, something startled the man. He turned, and there was a woman lying at his feet. Who are you? He asked her. I am your servant Ruth, she said. Spread the corner of your garment over me, since you are my guardian. You are a guardian redeemer of our family. Now, those words, spread the corner of your garment over me. Here again, we aren't Jews. We didn't grow up in this ancient Jewish tradition. This is something that is a tradition that would have been practiced not just in Jewish culture, but also in a lot of Eastern cultures at the time. Some other versions of Scripture, if you're reading in another translation, you might read the words, take me under your wing. Those two phrases are synonymous. They mean the same thing. It basically just means take care of me, protect me, provide for me. Both references are assumed to be about marriage and the protection that a woman would receive through her marriage to a man. And so we want to make it clear that Ruth is most likely not prostituting herself here, okay? That she's just merely saying, I need someone to take care of me. You have a responsibility to do this. And so I am letting you know that I am willing if you are willing. But what I really want you to understand about this particular section here is that Ruth demonstrates trust here. Now, we in our culture cannot even begin to fathom what Ruth is actually doing here because she's placing herself in a position of tremendous vulnerability. I want you all to think for just a moment about what she's actually doing. She's a foreigner in Judah. She comes from Moab. The Moabites are hated by the Jewish people, all right? So Ruth is a foreign woman, no husband, no nothing. She has nothing. And she's told to go down to a threshing floor and stay there in the middle of the night. Now, I want you all to think about that. Ladies who are here, I want you to imagine that somebody tells you, I want you to go downtown on the west side by yourself at midnight. There's going to be a dude sleeping on a threshing floor. I want you to uncover his feet and just lay down there. How many of you ladies are like, I'm in? Right? You're like, sign me up. Of course not. This is crazy. You know why Boaz is probably sleeping on the threshing floor that night? Because thieves, most likely, would come and steal his grain if he wasn't there. Remember, this is before the kingdom of Israel exists. There's no government. There's no security. These people are just tribes. Thieves would come and they would steal. So you've got this woman, this Moabite woman, walking through the streets in the dark by herself, going to a threshing floor to meet some dude and just lay down at his feet and stay there the whole night. Church, it's against this backdrop that Ruth comes to Boaz. You need to understand the culture. You need to understand the ramifications of what we're talking about. What is Ruth going to do if Boaz decides, hey, there's no one around. It's just me and her. I can do whatever I want, and it's her word against mine. Who are they going to believe, folks? The foreigner or the wealthy, influential Boaz? Who are they going to believe? What if Boaz is repulsed by the idea? And he's like, what kind of person are you? I thought you were better than this. And so he goes and he tells everybody this woman showed up in the middle of the night and uncovered his feet and was laying there. What does that do to her already tarnished reputation because she's a Moabite? You see, I think sometimes we hear the story of Ruth and we think, oh, that's so cool. She went, she told Boaz she liked him, and they made up happily ever after. But you have to understand what went to that, the trust that Ruth has to put forward in this story. So what will Boaz do? What is Boaz going to do? How is Boaz going to respond? I don't know about you, but I would be very uncomfortable if Naomi says to me, this is what I want you to do. But she does it. Man, just think about that for just a moment. That Ruth just does it. Trusts. Let's move on. Verse 10. Here's how Boaz responds when he finds Ruth laying at his feet in the middle of the night. The Lord bless you, my daughter. This kindness is greater than that which you showed earlier. You've not run after the younger men, whether they are rich or poor. And now, my daughter, do not be afraid. Because how many of you think Ruth was probably afraid in those moments? Yeah. I believe Ruth was probably terrified with the unknown. He says, I will do for you all that you ask. All the people of my town will know that you are a woman of noble character. Here it comes. Although it is true, he says, that I am a guardian redeemer of our family, there is another who is more closely related than I. Stay here for the night, and in the morning, if he wants to do his duty as your guardian redeemer, good, let him redeem you. But if he's not willing, as surely as the Lord lives, I will do it. Lie here, he says, until the morning. Now, folks, listen, I just try to be real about this story. Boaz is obviously an older guy, right? Because he says, hey, you haven't run after the younger guys that are probably way more attractive than me, right? And I have this funny feeling that Boaz is kind of attracted to Ruth, that he actually wants to marry her. Now, folks, listen, I don't know about you, but if I'm Boaz and I've got this woman laying at my feet whom I'm attracted to, and I like a whole lot, I probably don't really like the idea that there's someone closer than me who is the rightful person to be this kinsman's redeemer, right? So wouldn't you think, maybe, let's say that that's you. Do you have to absolutely do the right thing? Do you have to do the right thing? Of course you don't. Boaz has an opportunity. He could just be like, look, I mean, nobody needs to know about this. Like, who cares, right? I can keep this on the down low. I can go ahead and marry Ruth and everything will be fine. And let's just be real about it. It seems clear that he wants to, right? How many of you have ever wanted something, but you knew the right thing was potentially going to cost it? How many of you have ever been in that situation? You want something, but you know doing the right thing might cost you this opportunity that you have. What do? Do you trust God and kingdom, or do you goodness gracious, or do you lean in to empire and take control yourself? What do you do? And I believe in our story, what we find in Boaz is, again, this man of kingdom saying, the right thing to do is to let this other guy know. But think of the ramifications of what he's saying. What if this guy is mean and hateful and arrogant and proud? What if this guy isn't really interested in helping Ruth in any way, but he just feels an obligation? Right? Imagine Ruth if she ends up in a home where a guy is mean to her and unkind to her. Imagine the scenario if this guy refuses to carry on the family name through Ruth. These are all the things Boaz is risking by saying, we're going to give this other guy the opportunity to do the right thing. Moving on. So she laid his feet until morning, but he got up before anyone could be recognized, and he said, no one must know that a woman came to the threshing floor. He also said, bring me the shawl you're wearing and hold it out. When she did, he poured into it 6 measures of barley and placed the bundle on her. Then he went back to town. When Ruth came to her mother-in-law Naomi, asked her, how did it go, my daughter? Then she told her everything Boaz had done for her, and she added, he gave me these 6 measures of barley, saying, don't go back to your mother-in-law empty-handed. Now, I believe that Boaz's intent here on making sure that Ruth doesn't speak of this, not because he's trying to keep some scandalous secret, but because he wants to personally speak to this guy who's the rightful Goel, the rightful kinsman redeemer. He wants more than anything to do the right thing. Now, we can question his motives. We're not told of his motives, but it seems clear that for some reason he wants to do the right thing. And he proves his generosity to Ruth, not just in promising to be her Goel, but it's almost like he's saying, look, there's a chance that I'm not going to be able to do it. I might not be able to do this for you, but know this. He gives her these 6 measures of barley so she doesn't return empty-handed. Even if I'm not able to be your Goel, even if I can't redeem your family, I will still help take care of you. Do not go back to her empty-handed. Let her know that there's someone who will help provide and take care of, even if someone else doesn't. I don't want you to go back empty-handed. Finally, at the end, this is what Naomi says. Wait. Whew. How many of you like that word? I know, wait. Wait, my daughter, until you find out what happens, for the man will not rest until the matter is settled today. I get pretty irritated if I have to sit in the drive-through line in the morning for my unsweet tea at McDonald's. And if it's more than like 30 seconds, I'm irritated. You know why I'm irritated? Because I don't like to wait. How many of you like waiting? Do any of you like waiting? How many of you have ever gone to that job interview for that job you really want, right? And the interview goes great. And what do you have to do when you leave the room after you've had that interview? You have to wait. How many of you love living in that moment of wait? Do any of us love living in that moment of wait? Now, I want you to imagine something. Let's say that you had the opportunity to eliminate the wait and just take it into your own hands and do what you wanted. How many of you would just do it? See, in this story, I need you to understand something. Both Ruth and Boaz have opportunities to skip the wait. Y'all follow that? They have an opportunity to skip the wait and miss out on all the discomfort. Neither one of them have to do the things they're willing to do to trust in the story and experience this uncomfortableness in the wait. And yet they do. And I want to tell you something. I got to be honest. As I was putting this sermon together, I don't know about you, but when I'm in the wait, I'm thinking of all my backup plans. You know what I'm talking about? I'm strategizing, I'm planning, I'm figuring it out. Doing my best to cover every possible scenario. And I think the reason I do that is because I trust more in empire than I do in kingdom. I know I said it out loud, and some of you are like, oh, wow. And I just want you to be real here. I just want you to be real. Kingdom seems like such a cool idea, doesn't it? How many of you have ever read the New Testament? You're like, kingdom is awesome. Kingdom is awesome. And it makes sense to you right here in your heart, but then it makes its way up to your head, right? Because your head is the place you live in real life. See, your head, that's the place where you actually live and exist with all the other people around you. And while kingdom seems simple and cool, it also seems flat out impossible, right? Do any of you actually believe that the idea of kingdom that God lays out in Scripture is possible? Do any of you actually think it's possible? Listen, I know that's a hard question, isn't it? Because there's a part of me that when I answer that question, part of me wants to say no. I don't believe that kingdom is possible where I live. Right? Do any of you guys are looking, I can feel the thickness in the room right now. Because I think some of you are hearing me say, wait a minute, it sounds to me like you're saying God can't do something. Church, I'm not saying that at all. What I'm saying is I believe God can do something. And what he can do is change the hearts of his people to exist in kingdom rather than empire. But that means that his people have to do something like trust him. And we don't want to do that. And I'm not trying to be hard on any of you. I'm putting myself in your shoes. I don't want to do it. It's just hard to do because part of me says, unless everybody does it, nobody does it, and it's just not going to happen. Right? Like, God, are you literally asking me to walk away from all of my security and comforts and just live at the mercy of other people? Because that's what Jesus did, right? How many of you know how Jesus lived? Where was Jesus' address? Do we ever find that in Scripture? What town? Like, Jesus often lived at the mercy of other people to take care of him. How many of you are willing to do that? I know I'm not, and you don't want to know why? It's not because I don't trust God, and this is really hard for me to say out loud. It's because I don't trust you. Oh, church, seriously. You want to know why the world doesn't want anything to do with kingdom? Because they don't trust the people who live in kingdom. Why don't they trust the people who live in kingdom? Because we don't give them a reason to trust us. Now, I know that that's hard to hear, and you're like, man, Brian, what are you saying right now? What I'm trying to say is, unless we do what Boaz and Ruth did, we will not bring kingdom. We just won't. And I know some of you are like, why are you telling us all this? Why? It felt so good in the beginning. Right? Like it was so good, and now I'm all depressed, and I'm irritated, and I'm upset. I'm going to stop because I'm 5 minutes over. But what I want you to do for a minute is I want you to put yourself in Ruth's place, and I want you to put yourself in Boaz's place. And I want you to ask yourself, would I be willing to do what either one of these people did? Seriously. And I'm not saying just be like, well, of course I would because I trust Jesus. I'm asking you if you would actually do it. And then I want you to ask yourself this question. Are there any situations or circumstances where I face something like this right now and I'm just simply not doing it? Because you're the only one who knows the answer to that question. And these are hard questions. Look, I know they are. I've had to ask them of myself before I get up here and speak. Dawn and I, right now, almost daily have hard conversations like this, and they're terrible, right? It's terrible to think about, oh my goodness, what would happen if? What would happen if? See, there's something I want you to make sure you remember about last week in Tracy's sermon. He mentioned that Boaz was essentially telling Ruth that she was living in kingdom, right? Why would he tell her that she's living in kingdom? He can tell her that because he's living kingdom out in front of her. Do you all understand that? Because Boaz is living out kingdom, he can tell Ruth she's living in kingdom. And the truth is that the primary reason why Ruth is able to live in kingdom is because Boaz brought kingdom. What is God asking you to do to trust his story? I don't know the answer, okay? But what is God asking you to do to bring kingdom to the community in which you live? What is he asking you to do? To trust him enough that he will actually do what he says he will do. And that by you following him, by doing what he asks you to do, that you will bring kingdom to someone else right here, right now. As I close, do you believe that kingdom is God's plan for here and now? Or do you just believe it's a plan for somewhere in another time, another dimension, another space? Because I believe that there is something in the afterlife for those people who follow Jesus. But I also believe that kingdom is supposed to be here and now. And it requires trust for God's people to trust his story, to lean in and trust kingdom more than we trust an empire. I hope you'll come back next week because we're going to close the series in Ruth by looking at Ruth chapter 4 and the conclusion of the story. So hopefully you'll come back next week. But as you leave this week, please, please, please consider kingdom, consider empire, consider what it means to trust, and ask yourself the question, am I willing to trust God and his story? Would you pray with me? Heavenly Father, today I pray that these words that we have shared today, that this story of Ruth, Lord, is not some opinion piece that Tracy and I have come up with, God, but that all we're trying to do, Lord, is merely express your kingdom truth. That we're trying to help people understand what kingdom is and what it means to trust in it. Lord, may we as your people seek more to lean into kingdom and less into empire. And in doing so, help bring kingdom right here and right now. We love you, we praise you, we ask all of this in your name today.